Hey YouTube, Hickory Stick back with you again. Today we're going to be doing some fishing reel maintenance. Shimano Curado 70 MGL K. Got it cleaned up, got the bearings clean, got the reel clean, all the hard parts are cleaned. We have got everything dried out, ready to go. Now for cleaning, I just really do Gojo and a toothbrush on the main parts, and on the bearings I use a gun parts cleaner in an ultrasonic. I will flush them after the gun parts cleaner with isopropyl alcohol and call it good. Now before we go on to reassembly, let's talk about the bearings. On the bearings, you've got two 8x12x3 3.5s, two 3x10x4s, and two 5x9x3s. That's your standard bearings. Now if you want to upgrade the level wind to a bearing from the bushing, you need a 4x7x2.5. And as I said, we're going to be upgrading this level wind. We're going to put together the palming side plate first. So we're going to need the palm side plate. We're going to need the infinity brake. We are going to need the gear. We are also going to need the bearing. And we are going to need all of the miscellaneous hardware. A bearing washer. This is our washer for this gear right here. This goes in here, this goes in here. We're going to need our tension washer, our bearing retainer clip, and our miscellaneous bolts, our screws. You are also going to need the clear plastic shim. Do not forget this. This is extreme importance because this sets your brake offset from your spool, and that is very important. Like I said earlier, there may be more than one of these in your stack up. Now, the two of my reels that I have taken apart so far only had one, but if you look at the schematic actually shows three of them. So there could be up to three stacked up in there. Let's get started putting this back together. Now, remember, we turned our brake down to the minimum setting before we put the thing together, or took the thing apart. First thing we're going to do is we're going to put our O-ring and our flat washer in there. Now I'm going to separate the O-ring flat washer. The O-ring still has a little bit of grease on it. I'm going to leave its original grease on it, and I'm just going to make sure it's in there like it's supposed to be. Take our flat washer, put our flat washer in there, use our flat washer to push our O-ring on down in there. Now we've got our black screw and our thick washer that go together. All right, now when you put this thing together, you'll notice that right here, there's a post. There's a corresponding post inside the gear. So when you put these two things together, you're going to have to line up the post with the gear. And you want that post to stop it if you're turning it counterclockwise. And when you do that, that's going to line your 1 and your 4 up kind of in this direction. Now I've got it turned upside down, but if you got it sitting here like you're going to have your plate in it, your 1 and your 4 kind of lined up like that, with the 4 pointing towards your bottom notch on the plate. Now we're going to put our screw in. You're going to need your T10. Don't strip your screw, but your screw does bottom out, and there should be a hard stop, and you still should have nice smooth movement. See, everything's working properly. When we spin it, everything works properly. Now we're going to put some grease on this before we put it together. So we're going to get the semi-fluid grease. Now, about this grease, Duthlon sends you diagrams of where you should put your grease. And what it boils down to basically is they recommend you put the semi-fluid grease anywhere that's not going to be fast spinning, but has contact with the other surfaces except the main gears. Main gears get the gear grease. So we're going to go in here and we're going to grease these spokes in this gear. And Toothlon says to be sparing. That's how I've got mine. And I'm going to run it back and forth and make sure I greased it far enough around. And I did. Now what I want to do, I want to put some grease down in this area to make sure I'm getting grease on the inside of this mechanism. And I'm going to have to take this back off to do it because I didn't realize I wouldn't be able to get in there. We're going to put some grease in here and then I'm going to spin it. There we go. And we're going to reinstall our gear. Now it's greased good. Now we can install this into our side cover. I'm going to do one final check to make sure our one is lined up. Now let's get our clear washer. This washer is going to sit on here like that. Now with this hole, now it will fall off. So you've got to do this little dance here. There we go. And he's sitting in there. Now we're going to put our 3 screws in. For that I'm going to grab my needle noses. Drop the first one in. Swap back out to a Phillips head because pretty well everything else is Phillips. Careful not to strip these. This is a plastic housing now. You can strip them. They do not have to be real tight. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to clean up this little flat washer. I did not clean this in the sink with the Gojo and toothbrush because I did not want to run the risk of dropping this. This is like a hard phenolic. There's some wear on this side, so I'm going to flip it over. It don't have much wear, but I'm still going to flip it over when I put it in. All right, now he's in there. Now I'm going to put some of the semi-fluid grease on it. Now I'm going to drop the bearing in. Now we're going to put the high-speed bearing oil. We're going to put a sparing amount of that. We're going to spin our bearing. Make sure we got good coverage. Spin that in, and then we're going to put a little more. Now we're going to put a bearing retainer clip in, which you could put the clip in before you put the oil on. Your choice. And the bearing retainer clip slides in. And now the side plate, the palming side plate, is reassembled. Okay, now we'll start the frame assembly. First thing we're going to do over here is I'm going to reinstall our palming plate lock and the plate that holds it, its screw, and its detent ball. Okay, I'm going to pack some semi-fluid grease down in there just to protect this little spring. And then I'm going to put the spring and the detent ball back into the hole. Then I'm going to put a little bit of semi-fluid grease on the surface where the control lever rides. Set the lever down and put a little grease on it. Set the clip on it. It's not going to sit down all the way due to the fact that the detent ball and spring are holding it up. But your screw will mash all of it down. Just make sure that your dowel, your locating dowel, is in the correct position. And you can get your level wind in there with this on. And make sure that moves correctly. And it does. Next up, let's reassemble the level wind. So for the level wind, we will need our 2 copper washers, our small E-clip. We will need our small pin, level wind guide, our tube, pawl cover, our level wind gear, the level wind shaft, and the pawl. We also need the level wind guide shaft. Now we would be using our plastic bushing if we were going back together normally, but on this reel, we're going to upgrade the level wind to a bearing. This is the 4x7 by 2.5 bearing. So we're going to put our bearing on. The bearing is going to go on the shaft on this end. It's going to be a tight fit. Now I'm going to drop a little oil on it. Then I'm going to force a little grease in it. a little bit of the semi-fluid grease, and I'm going to spin it around. Then I'm going to come to the other side and I'm going to force a little grease in it from there. The next thing we're going to put on is our gear. The gear slides on to the outside like so, with the indentions for the shaft pointed towards the end of the level wind shaft. And you're going to push your little shaft in. You can clock this thing 90 degrees each way. Doesn't matter which way you clock it. Now the easy thing to do will be to push this bearing back over against it to where it kind of holds the gear on the end to keep that gear from moving back and letting your little pin fall out. Now your next step, you're going to have to do several things at once here. Number one, we're going to put in our level wind shaft here. And then we're going to put our guide, our level wind guide, in there also from this way. I'm going to push our shaft in, line it up with the hole on the other side, and get it in the hole. Make sure you put your level wind where it's facing out, because that's the way it goes. Then we're going to take our level wind housing, we're going to push it in, and now it is keyed on the end. See the keys? So we're going to line our keys up and pop it through the hole. The next thing we can do is we can push our shaft in. But before we go in, we're going to grease it on the end. We're going to use the semi-fluid grease, because once we push it through, it's going to be hard to get grease in the hole because this is a tight fit. Then we're going to shove our shaft through. We're going to line it up with the hole out here on the end, push it in until it all bottoms out. Should be poking up from the end just like that. Okay, now we're ready to put our copper washers on. We're going to put some semi-fluid grease all around the end here of the shaft. Make sure this is well greased around the end of this shaft. Then we're going to take our first copper washer. We're going to sit him on, and we're going to grease the face of him. We're going to put our second washer on, and we're going to make sure he's greased. We're going to put our E-clip on and get it started just like that. And then I'm going to take my needle nose pliers, pop the E-clip on gently. All we've got left to do is put the pawl in. The pawl's bi-directional, can go in either way. If you've got wear on your pawl, you want to flip it over. This pawl has next to no wear on it. The pawl goes in vertically, and you'll have to move your thing a little bit to get it to fit in. Now we've got to grab our little pawl spacer, that little bitty flat washer, and he's going to go on the end of the pawl. And I'm going to put a little bit of this grease on that O-ring before I screw the pawl cover on. I'm going to get a flathead screwdriver, tighten the pawl cover. Once again, these are plastic parts. Don't bear down on them. You just need them snug. Now your level wind is completely assembled. We will grease it later. By the way, that completes the assembly of everything over here. The next thing that you're going to want to do, though, is to put your guard on. This guard right here. The reason why you want that to be your next thing is because this guard actually holds your guide shaft for your level wind in place. Now keep in mind, you don't have a screw for this side, but you do have one for this side. So we're going to go ahead and put that on. And that is this little small Phillips head screw, machine screw. Little short thing. Once again, you just want to snug it. And don't worry about access. You've still got plenty of access to get in there and grease your level wind. But this will keep your level wind from anything from falling apart on your level wind. Now we can start assembling your gear side. And what we're going to do next is we're going to install our bearing for our pinion. So that is one of the 8x12 by 3.5 bearings. And it goes right in there just like that. I consider this a high-speed bearing, so we're going to use high-speed bearing oil. Next, we're going to start assembling the clutch. We got a bunch of pieces for the clutch. First thing you're going to put on is your base plate, your clutch base plate. You do not need to put any grease underneath this. This is not a moving part. It is solid. It sits on there. You've got your two indentions in it for your two screw indentions for your clutch. And it sits on just like that. You've got two of these short, big-headed black screws. They go in to hold it down. Once again, snug, do not over tighten. The next thing you're going to put in is your clutch lever. Now, if you set your clutch lever in here, you can look and see where all it slides. And by that, you will be able to know where all you need to grease. So basically, you're looking at this thing, you're going to have to grease all around here, and you're going to have to grease this entire area right here. And you're going to need to grease right out in here, because if you'll notice, it slides in there also. So you're going to need to grease that. And we're going to grease that with the semi-fluid grease. Not a huge amount, but some grease in there. Now, before you can put this in, you need to put your side plate for your clutch button on. And it goes back in here, just like that. It matches the curve. There's simply two holes that line up. And I'm going to put some semi-fluid grease. You can see where this one's been wearing right on it. So where it's been wearing, I'm going to put some semi-fluid grease, just to give it some wear protection. Your clutch lever has got to sit in there. You're going to put it in now. You're going to kind of have to hold it. This may be a little fiddly. You've got to sit your lever into the clutch button. And you're going to have to line it up with the posts in the clutch button. It's a little bit fiddly to do. Now I'm just going to cradle it in my hand, and I'm going to get the screw. Remember I said that this screw is a coarse thread plastic, or a coarse thread screw, and it's the only one like it in the whole reel. Drop the screw back in its hole. I'm going to go in underneath, put the screw in. Now we've got that installed, we got it greased. I'm just going to move it some just to spread the grease around. I'm going to put the clutch in the up or disengaged position. The next thing you've got to lay down is your clutch ramp. And it sits in here like this. There is a pin, a dowel on the back side of it that matches up with this dowel right here. It sits on there like that, and it moves with your clutch lever. But it does ride a little bit up against this edge. So I'm going to grease that edge a little bit with the semi-fluid grease. Well, if you can see that. The other thing you've got to have is your disengagement dog. He goes in that hole right there, lines up like that, and he rides down in this area. And he just kind of wanders around in there. So we're going to grease that entire area. And the spring connects from here to here and points back this way. So you got to put all that together at one time. So I'm going to take this loose first of all, and I'm going to get my grease in this area. I'm also going to grease the hole that he rides in so that he don't wear in there. Then we're going to have our clutch spring. Now your clutch spring has a short side and a long side. The long side goes into this hole over here. The short side goes up into the clutch dog. Now you're not going to be able to put all this together and connect that spring onto there. You're going to have to put the dog in his hole, put his spring on him underneath like so, and let the spring hang out to the side. Make sure he's down in his little track area. Let his spring hang out, and we'll connect that spring in just a second. Because first off, we need to make sure all this is held down, and that is the case of this thing. Now this can orient actually in two ways. You can orient it like that, or you can orient it like that. Don't ask me why. My assumption is that this part is used in multiple reels. But if you look at the diagram, your diagram shows it orienting with our screws in this hole and this hole, which means to match up with our screws, it's got to orient like that. Now it does ride a little bit, just narrowly on this. So I'm going to add some grease to this thing around these edges. We're going to put him in, And we're going to use the 2 little clutch screws to put him together. Now I find it easier to put these screws in with my finger to get them started in the hole with the screwdriver and my finger. Don't tighten either screw down all the way until you have both screws in. Now this one on this side, I'm going to ease him in there with my needle nose because my fingers is too fat. The reason why I find it a little easier to put the other one in with my finger is my needle nose don't grip this one real good. Once you've got them both started, you can tighten them down. Once again, remember, snug, not super tight. Now our dog is in there. Everything's greased and moving properly. Now that those 2 screws are in there, now we're going to put our little spring, our clutch spring, into his hole. And the best way to do that is to grab him with a pair of needle nose. And push him in. That's how he's supposed to look when he's in there. And you can check your function just like that. The next thing you want to do is your throw out bearing. He's going to sit on there like that. And he's going to ride on this ramp and this ramp. So we want to grease those ramps well. We've got to grease him for our pinion. We have not greased our pinion yet, so we need to grease our throw out bearing for our pinion. For that, we're going to use our gear grease. And we're going to fill this channel right here on both sides with the gear grease and the mouth. And we're going to give it a generous amount of the gear grease, because this will rotate constantly. Now we're going to set him on here, and I'm going to lock the clutch for now. Now I want to put a little bit of grease on this pinion right here. A little bit of the semi-fluid grease I want to put on the pinion in this area where he's going to go into his bearing. Not a lot. And then I want to put a little bit inside here where in his jaws where the spool dogs will grab. Not a huge pile, but you know, some. I don't want to put any grease inside of there because that's going to be where the free spools, when it turns. What I want to put in there inside of here is high-speed oil. Now I'm going to set the pinion into the throw out bearing, and the big end of the pinion goes down. He's going to set in the throw out bearing like that. Everything's going to set down, and the pinion is going to go into the bearing. And all of this should spin freely. And it does. Now we will grease this gear in a few minutes. Last thing for the clutch will be the 2 clutch springs. But I'm not going to put them on just this second because they are prone to go to flying. So we're going to leave those off for now, but we are going to go ahead and grease their shafts with semi-fluid grease real well. We are now going to assemble the bottom end of our main drive rod. So we're going to need the drive shaft, the gear, the plate, the dog, the bearing, the brake plate, and the brake pressure lever. And we will also need our 2 drag washers. Okay, remember now, inside of this thing was this little detent ball. What we're going to do is I'm going to put some semi-fluid grease up in this hole just for protection for this thing. And then we're going to put him back in. Now this is another thing that's a little fiddly to get on. We're going to put our gear on. Gear's the same either way, doesn't matter which way it goes. But it's a little fiddly to get this thing on because you got to compress this thing and set this gear on it. Now the easiest way I found to do it was to start the gear on one side like that, line your little detent ball up with its hole, and then press the detent ball in with your fingernail and work your gear on like that. That's the easiest way I found to do it. Alright, we don't want him to pop off, so I'm going to be real careful when I set him down. Now the next thing you got to have is your plate. Plate's going to go on there like that and right in there. So we're going to put semi-fluid grease all around this surface because that plate is going to be riding right there. So your plate sits down Then you got your bearing. This is a 5 to 9 by 3 bearing. Now before I put him on, I'm going to force a little semi-fluid grease in him on one side. Then I'm going to push him on the shaft like that. But then I'm going to push a little more semi-fluid grease in on him. Now we will need our washer. This is that steel washer. Drop him on, and I'm going to try to get him centered because he does ride. He rides on the face of the bearing. And then we got an E-clip. Now we're going to take the E-clip, put the E-clip on, get it started. Grab our needle nose pliers. Pop the E-clip on. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put some grease in the hole that the bearing goes in. And this is not to help the bearing rotate in the hole, because we don't really want the bearing rotating in the hole. This is to make sure the bearing don't get stuck and freeze up in the hole. I just want a little bit of coating of grease in there. And then we're going to take our bearing, press our bearing down in the hole, line up our holes right there on our plate, and we're going to take our other 2 short black screws and we're going to screw this down. Not going to tighten either one until I get both of them started. Okay, now we're going to grease our level wind gear drive gears here. We're going to grease them with the semi-fluid grease. And the way I grease my gears is I put a little dab of grease in each gear on the big gear. And I let the big gear grease the little gear by spinning it. And to me, that distributes grease really well between the 2 gears. Now let's go ahead and grease our level wind while we're in here. While we're greasing the level wind gear set. And I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to spread grease all along inside this level wind. I'm going to put a small amount along the guide rod and along the outside of the housing. And I'm going to take the stuff I put outside on the housing, and I'm going to kind of try to spread it with my finger. Same thing with the stuff on the rod. Don't want a big old pile on there. I don't want to collect dirt and grime and stuff. I want just enough to give it a little lubrication so it slides a little better. Let's go ahead and start stacking up our gear side here. The first thing you're going to put on is your clutch release gear. He sits on like that. Your next thing is your drag washer, your inner drag washer. Now we need our drag grease. The way I'm doing this drag grease is I'm putting, this is thick grease now. I'm just putting it on there like that, and I'm going in with my finger and I'm smearing it onto the washer really well, and then I can repeat on the other side. Now that washer sits down. Then it will be your gear. It will sit down next, and you're going to have to mesh him with your pinion. Then you're going to put your other drag washer, and we're going to grease him. He goes in there. That is all we require of this drag washer grease. Then our top plate, our cover plate for our drag washers. Now, we need to grease this gear. And I'm going to go about greasing this gear the same way I grease the other gears. I'm going to put a line of grease all along his teeth. I'm going to make sure I hit every tooth. And I'm going to make sure I put enough grease that I think it'll spread through all the teeth and across the entire surface of the teeth. And now I'm going to spin it. And he's going to grease the pinion as well. And then I'm just going to make sure I got good coverage. And I'm happy with that. That looks pretty good. Now that concludes this grease. The next thing we're going to put on here is our engagement shaft right here. And even though this thing doesn't rotate, it's not supposed to rotate, it will rotate if the clutch slips. So I'm going to put some semi-fluid grease on the inside of this thing. And it got on the threads, that's okay. Lastly, now I'm going to drop on our clutch springs. So now we're going to start assembling our drive side guide plate. Our drive side plate. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put together our drag star. So we got the star, we got our clicker, we have our keeper for the clicker, and we've got our clicker spring and detent ball. Now let's put a little grease in the hole. I'm going to put my detent into my spring. Both of them down in the hole. Put a little grease in here where this rides. Put that in. And then we will put our keeper clip in. That's reassembled. Set that to the side. Now side plate. First thing we're going to do to the side plate is we're going to grease up our anti-reverse bearing. And we're going to put a bunch of grease in this thing, because this thing sees lots of abuse. We want to make sure that he is well protected. So I kind of glob the grease in him, and then I kind of pack it like you would a wheel bearing as best as I can. Now this is going to go in from this back side, and it kind of got a way it goes in. Remember, the chamfered side goes out, so it sits in there like this, and it kind of will sit in there how it wants to sit, and you will push it in until it bottoms out. Next up will be your shaft support bearing. It goes in from this direction. I'm going to try to put some semi-fluid grease in him before putting him down in a hole. Now he's going to go down in here. I'm going to spin him first. I'm going to push some grease in there. We're going to put our spool bearings in. Now this is the pinion support bearing, and this is the spool bearing. The pinion support bearing goes in first. He goes all the way down in there deep. We're going to give him oil. Then we have our spacer. It's just a plastic spacer. The spacer goes in next. Ambidextrous, doesn't matter which way you put it in. Then our spool bearing. Same thing, we're going to give the spool bearing a generous amount of oil. Now, we need our retainer clip. He goes in last. Make sure he's seated good, and he is. Now we have our O-ring. Goes on here. That we had taken off to protect it. I'm going to put a little grease on it, a little semi-fluid grease. Now our cap, our tension cap. Inside the tension cap, we have a tension washer, and we've got a rubber plate that goes in the very bottom. Down in the bottom of the cap, I'm going to put some semi-fluid grease. Now this is to hold the rubber plate in, nothing more. And we're going to ease the plate over into the hole. Then we're going to cover the plate and the outer edge, and that's to hold this in. He's got a wear spot. We're going to turn it over. Drop him in, get him centered in there, get him squished into the grease, and that's what it's going to look like. We're going to grease him, grease that center of him where the wear point will be. And we're going to screw our cap on, get it started, and make sure when you get it started that you don't pinch your O-ring. Make sure your O-ring goes up in there. I'm going to give this a little oil from the backside. Now we are ready to place our side plate onto our frame. We're going to make sure that this sleeve is down inside of the drag plate correctly. We're going to put our finger on our bearing to hold our bearing and make sure it does not ride out until we get it down in there. Now we're going to start putting screws in. I'm going to begin with the long screw. Remember, the long screw goes at the top, center, with him in, it'll hold. Drop the next 2 screws in. They're the same length, doesn't matter where you put them. And the final screw goes on the back side. It is the coarse thread screw that will screw into the plastic housing. Okay, now we've got extra grease and all on here. I'm just going to kind of smear it around just to protect the threads. Now, we've got to stack up our stuff here underneath our drag star. We've got your brass thrust washer goes on first. Then you've got your 2 concave drag washers, and they go opposite directions from each other. You want them to be put together with a little gap in them like that. Doesn't matter which way they go as long as they're opposite directions of each other. Then we've got our our aluminum top thrust washer. Then our nut. And the nut has a channel cut in it right here. The channel is for the spring to sit in. So the channel has to go out. So we're going to spin him down just until he's got a little bit of tension on him. Put our spring on. Now we're going to try to line up our clicker with our nut. If you'll notice, the clicker is turned straight to the points of the nut. So we've got to make the points of the nut line up with the points of the shaft, and it does by chance. Otherwise you'd have to adjust it. And then you just got to put this thing on there. Make sure your spring is on, and make sure your spring is sitting in its track. And then you just got to work this on. There you go. Because you've got to get it pushed down until the larger step of the shaft goes through the clicker. Handle can go on, and the handle nut. Now I'm just going to spin it, make sure all the grease is spread everywhere really well. Anti-reverse bearing's working good. Make sure the clutch works good. Let's put our spool back in. That goes forward for open. Now I want to put a little grease on these slides for the open and close, because that's a little tight. Now they are right here, so I'm gonna put a little grease on them. Locked up. That's nice. Oh, it sounds beautiful. It's quiet, it's smooth. Honestly, can't say as to feel any difference between the bushing and the bearing on the level wind. So if you're thinking about doing this, if you're like me and you have a random bearing laying around, yeah, it might be worth your while to throw it in, but I wouldn't go spend money on a bearing, because I honestly don't really feel any difference between the two. But I hope this helps you out. I hope that this teaches you something. I thank you for coming along with me, and until next time, this is Hickory Stick. Y'all have a good one.